Good morning and welcome to the first session of The Giants. We're so thrilled to have the one and only Brianne Kimmel joining us for the next 30 minutes. My name is Tip, I'm part of the Blackbird team and I'll be your host for today. The outcome of the session is to understand the different strategies of go-to-market, whether it's B2B, B2C, partnerships, and geographically. We'll also talk about why operator angels can accelerate your go-to-market. If you have any questions for Brianne to answer live, go to slido.com and use hashtag Brianne. And make sure you tweet what you've learned today using hashtag Giants. Our speaker today is not only an incredible operator leading product and go-to-market teams at Zendesk, but also named Business Insider's top angel investor every startup should know with her fund, WorkLife. Brianne's fund focuses on helping startups go to market. And for early stage startups, Brianne also gets hands-on with customer development as well. Brianne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's all good. We have a limited time, so let's jump right into it. Let's start with a bit of a warm-up question for you, Brianne. What's a typical question you get asked a lot by early stage founders who are just beginning to define their go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, great question. So I'll give you a little bit of context on my background. So while I was at Zendesk, I looked at both our self-serve business and partnered with our sales team as we started to move up market. And so for the period in time in which I was there, we went from 1 product to 7 products. And we, very gradually moved from a primarily self-serve model into both self-serve plus sales assisted. And so oftentimes when I talk to early stage startups, there tends to be an assumption that you either go bottom up or top down. And in many cases, depending on, who you're selling to or what type of product you have, you may actually have to build for both. And so I think oftentimes when I meet with an early stage company, especially around, seed and series A, I think they're at this inflection point where they're trying to figure out, to what extent can they use their product and their engineering team to really go completely self-serve and not have to worry about sales whatsoever? And can they get to repeatable revenue through tactics like, product-led growth and in-product virality? Or to what extent do they need to hire their first salesperson? And so in a lot of ways, I partner with both the engineering team and oftentimes make introductions and help with that first sales hire, which oftentimes looks like a very technical person and someone who can speak to both worlds. And so I do spend a lot of time figuring out, to what extent can a company go fully self-serve, or to what extent do they need to hire someone or, develop a real rigor around founder-led sales, where they actually start proactively engaging with customers rather than relying on just what's coming inbound.
Awesome. And just to dig into that a little bit more, it's pretty common for early stage startups to be overweight in product and engineering talent. Can you talk about how these product engineering heavy teams can grow their startup and presence without having to hire a bunch of sales reps? So you talked about self-serve. Maybe elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I think right now what's been really interesting, I do spend a lot of time with developer tools, design tools. I mean, Canva being one of the best examples of a very much bottom up and self-serve, design tool. I think in a lot of ways, it depends on who you're selling to. If you are building a tool that's going to be adopted by individual engineers or developers, I think the most important role and critical hire that has to happen early on is a developer evangelist. And so those individuals are actually quite interesting because there's different types of developer evangelists. And so you'll find individuals who have previously been, at a major platform, like maybe they've come from an Atlassian or AWS, or just have a very technical background and they're very good with strategic partnerships and building almost like group activations across different engineering teams. You also find individuals that are really great at, contributing on GitHub and hosting events. And they're more of an individual developer evangelist that has like a very strong personality and, they're a great community builder. And so I think that there are some great examples there where you can have very different types of personalities or different experience, and some are technical, some are non-technical. But I think really identifying who is the right person for the product that you're selling, and can they actually build, real trust and loyalty with the developer community is really important. I think if you look at, something like a Canva or something that's going after more of a creative community, so I would bucket that as freelancers, creative agencies, individual designers, people who are designing on evenings and weekends. Oftentimes with, those sort of products, you can get by early on with, a really good SEO strategy. And so I think if anything, Canva is a great example of this, where I look at a lot of tools like Figma, Notion, Airtable, Canva, and I think oftentimes to really get the early product-led growth started, you end up coming up with a series of use cases and templates, and a lot of it is like front-loading a lot of the questions that potential customers may have or potential users may have, and turning that into content and turning that into real turnkey applications and ways for them to get started. I'll give an example there. I was an angel investor in Webflow, and one of the core reasons for the investment is when looking at their community and their clonable template gallery, I realized that you would have an individual designer, and it's a no-code product, so these are not classically or professionally trained designers who are actually building no-code websites. They would then, do the Webflow equivalent of open sourcing it. And you would see individual designs that would have, up to 10,000 views, 1,000 or so shares, and people are actually building on each other's designs. And I thought that was a really unique insight where you can actually use, your core product offering and create ways for people to actually build their own personal brand and, access additional work. And so today we're actually seeing, there are a number of individuals who've actually started their own Webflow consultancies, where once you build one template and you get enough, shares or people building on top of it, you can actually start to monetize some of those behaviors and create your own book of business, which is really cool.
Awesome. And on that no-code movement, Tate Atkins actually asked, what impact will no-code movement have on the broader tech ecosystem, and do these tools change the way you think about effective go-to-marketing strategies as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think right now, in a lot of ways, there have been a whole class of low-code, no-code tools that were primarily carving out more of the front-end web development experience. And so you have Webflow, you have Glide Apps, which is a no-code way to launch mobile applications. I think that if anything, the end user experience for consumers is getting better because you have all of these templates, you have people that are building on each other's work. I think the output is actually a much better consumer experience. And, from an individual builder standpoint, what's really interesting is oftentimes these applications are being used by both technical and non-technical individuals. And so I think if anything, it's, the engineers that are using these applications are finding ways to, be more efficient, be more productive, augment, their personal experience and kind of complement what they're currently building with expertise from someone else. And so I like that model, and I think that is where, software development's going. I think that is where I spend a lot of time with tech companies, where it's like, in a lot of ways, slowly over time, we're seeing new applications that are replacing, a really complicated problem with a really clean and simple single line of code. And I do spend a lot of time in that space because I think if anything, developer productivity is really important for companies. I also think that, especially for, developers and more technical people inside of the company, like, there are definitely things that you want to work on, and that tends to be core product, and that tends to be really interesting features. I think the things that we're slowly starting to automate away are some of the internal use cases, like building internal tools, or I've invested in a couple of companies that are basically best in class single line of code, replaces the need to build like billing architecture. And so if you talk to engineers, it's like no one really wants to work on billing. No one really wants to work on internal tools. There's like a lot of these use cases where it's like not the most interesting problems to solve inside of a company. And so if anything, it's helping people be more productive at work. It's also helping to reduce some of the more boring aspects of their job as well.
Great. Thomas from Drewley's question is, you've worked with a range of B2B and B2C SaaS companies. How has your approach to helping startups to find the go-to-market strategy differ between B2B and B2C?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in a lot of ways, I will say that the investments that I've made that are more B2B, they do tend to be more consumer founders or more consumer product builders. And so I actually think over time, the two worlds are definitely starting to converge in a really interesting way. When I spend time with more bottom-up enterprise, consumer founders that are building their first B2B product, I think what's great is they do bring a very product-led and a very, a real rigor around product design. And so if anything, I would love to, 10 years from now, I would love to say that every single company has made workplace software a lot better for the individual person that uses it every day. Because I think there's just a lot of products that are the default solution, but they aren't the best ones to work with. And so I think in those cases, oftentimes, it is more or less helping consumer founders or individuals that love building great products. It's helping them really uncover, what is their clear path to repeatable revenue. And I think oftentimes what's different about consumer and more workplace products is, in workplace, you have to really uncover who is the buyer, who's the person that's using the product, and like where's the budget coming from. And so I think in a lot of ways, in the very early days, one of the things that I do spend a lot of time with companies on is also willingness to pay tests. And so if anything, it's really figuring out, especially in this new environment, to what extent are you building a problem that someone inside of a company is willing to pay for? And so I think that in a lot of ways, when I say, WorkLife helps technical teams with the not so technical stuff, it does tend to be finding a path to revenue. It does tend to be understanding product and engineering, but not necessarily, jumping into the code base directly. It's more or less like coming at it with a very product and engineering appreciation and deep appreciation for the efficiency of a product-led model, but also combining that with more early sales tactics, or at least, determining to what extent they can uncover new revenue streams quickly.
Great. Let's talk a bit about partnerships as a go-to-market channel. Could you share some insights on the online partnership you ran, for example, when you were at Expedia with Tinder, and what you learned from those types of campaigns?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sure. Great question. It's been a while since I thought about that, but it was interesting. So when I was living in Sydney, I was actually working at an agency, and my key account was Nikon. And so I had started doing very early influencer, marketing programs. How do we get cameras in the hands of interesting people? And at that time, more micro influencers. And so, I ended up working with Sass and Bide, Margaret Zhang. I started working with a lot of these people that have now, gone on to start bigger and better things. I actually caught up with Margaret yesterday, which was really funny. And so she's now living in New York, and it's one of these things where I think that, especially when you're starting a company, like whether it's an agency, whether it's a startup, whether it's, whatever you want to build, I think really building long-term relationships with the individual users is important. And so the one thing that I think about a lot, and this is something that I've carried throughout my career and even now with WorkLife, is, to what extent do you really help individuals be better at their job, or help individuals get where they want to go next? And so I think in a lot of ways, the partnerships that a lot of the early stage companies that I've backed, they tend to be more strategic partnerships that either augment certain parts of the product, or strategic partnerships or brand activations that help them strengthen their community. And so I think this is a really interesting one, where I know we're going to talk about, angel investing strategies in a little bit, but I think what's interesting is you'll end up finding that in a lot of these, especially in workplace, building a strong community and also understanding how technology gets used across a number of different companies is a key differentiator. And so when I think about partnerships, I think Zendesk has done this incredibly well, where you have both the apps marketplace, where individual users are building Zendesk integrations, and you're essentially leaning on individuals at other companies to help strengthen your own platform, and I think that's really important. I think there's also the idea of to what extent can you use your product, your website, your web traffic to help elevate your customers. And so I think one thing that work life companies do very early on is we do a lot of customer conversations. We do, well, in the light of COVID, we've been doing, over Zoom customer conversations where we'll actually invite, we've done head of design, we've done head of DevOps. Tomorrow we're doing like a head of culture dinner and happy hour over Zoom. And so if anything, it's finding ways to build deep relationships with your customers, whether that's either, a true partnership where you're helping them, elevate their product using your website, or whether that's basically using a technology integration or partnering with their founder to actually improve your product. But I think we're entering a world where it's like everyone's 1 or 2, degrees removed. And so if anything, the one thing that we saw at Zendesk a lot is when we would host events like our support leadership forum, you would actually find individuals that come year after year, but they would oftentimes, make a jump to the next company. And so they also use these sort of activations and these sort of community events or partner-led activities to actually find their next job. And so I think that's a really interesting way to think about retention is like, can you have almost relationship-led retention, which both improves your product, but also retains your customers.
I have a quick follow-up question from Nikki from Rocket Hub. She asks, for startups wanting to initiate a conversation with potential partners, either to help distribute the product or integrate with the platform, how should they go about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to fundraising. I think if anything, if there are mutual connections or if you can get a warm intro, I oftentimes will find ways to go through a warm introduction to make things to set off the conversation on in the right form, where I think it's much easier to have an intro conversation and find ways to work together than to try and pitch someone something. So I think in a lot of ways, especially as an early stage company, I think that I always like to keep in mind, like, especially when you're thinking about partnerships or working with another brand, like it's also helpful to just start by comparing notes or to even just ask for advice. I think startups have like the luxury of saying we're really early stage and we're trying to figure it out. And I truly believe that other professionals and especially other companies want to be inherently helpful. And so I oftentimes find it's much better to have a more informal conversation or, really have almost like a sales exploration call before trying to push a partnership where maybe it's not quite right or they're not quite ready.
Great. And here's a question for Australian and New Zealand founders launching a new product into the US. What are the differences and similarities versus launching locally, if any at all?
Good question. I think it really depends on the product. I think that if you look at, I'll use Canva as the local example. I think that when you have a really strong SEO strategy and the use cases are the same across different geographies, I think you can scale quite easily and quite organically. Zendesk, we saw this specifically where it's like, a lot of the inbound leads came internationally. We didn't quite establish an international hub or presence in a new country until there was a large enough density of customers in the region, or if there was like a more of a strategic motivator where there's like one key account or 2 key accounts that you really want to land, and being local is helpful there. And so I think if anything, expanding to the US, depending on the product, ideally shouldn't take too much of a lift. I will say that I think one thing that Atlassian did incredibly well is I think having a local presence on the sales and marketing side can be a really strong strategy, just because I do find, especially if you're selling to other Bay Area startups, or especially if you want to scale into some of the larger tech companies, I think having an established person here with an existing an existing network and trusted network will help accelerate a lot of those conversations.
Awesome. And I saw a lot of folks have been interacting with you over Twitter, Brianne, and they've asked you for some sort of prediction around the futures or even types of founders you'll expect to see.
Yeah. Thank you everyone who reached out on Twitter. It was awesome to hear from everyone. I think right now it's been a really interesting few months for everyone. And so I think, like, first things first, I hope everyone's family and friends and colleagues are all safe. The one thing that's been really interesting is just, I think there's this general period of speculation where it's like, what is the new normal? And I think what's interesting is, with a fund that has a name like WorkLife, I think that in a lot of ways, there have been a few themes that I've been really following and tracking and believe are the future. And, remote work and, remote productivity has been one of them. I think the interesting thing is, none of us could have predicted this sort of global forcing function and such an extended period of work from home culture. And so I think if anything, for individuals that are at tech companies or people that are starting companies, I'm very optimistic. I think it's going to be it's a great time to build something new. I think the caveat there is that the bar and, more the expectations on the venture side, I think have gone up week over week. And so I think if anything, the one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is like, what are new business models, new types of founders, new, parts of the ecosystem where, it's just a great time to start building. And so I think one area, there's been a few themes I've been exploring. One is designers who can code, or like the rise of the design-led founder. And so if you look at Airtable, Notion, Figma, Superhuman, the companies that have really, gone mainstream, blown up, raised large rounds, like they do have a very specific opinion around product design. And I think if anything, it's been interesting to see to what extent can you marry a really strong vision for the product with really consistent and quality execution. And so I do look to platforms like Figma a lot. I don't know if Matt's on, but Loom is a great example where I think that we will continue to see really great products that are loved by individual users. And so if anything, like I think right now is a great time where I've talked to a lot of founders that are spending more time on product design. They're spending more time at home, like checking out other people's apps. And so I think if anything, it's giving us all a real strong vision around like, what are the things that should exist? And can we either build something entirely new using our own product vision, or can we actually look at some of the like legacy software solutions or tools that people hate using, and can we actually reinvent it with a better design DNA? And so I think that we will see more product design is really important. We'll see more, a real shift towards like that founding product designer is going to be a really important role for every startup. And I think we'll see more design-led founders. The other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is I also think there's really something in just, career jumping. And so I think there's some really, there's some really crazy, outlandish examples where if you look at, Robin from Peloton, it's like everyone knows Robin, the Peloton instructor. However, she was more of a self-taught instructor that had originally been a lawyer. And so I think in these periods of uncertainty or in these periods of, extended time at home, I'm actually very curious to see how creative people get with self-taught learning, maybe launching their own course, maybe finding new ways to make that career change while we have a bit more time at home and while we're sort of reevaluating what we want to do next.
Great. In the last couple of minutes, we'll shift gears a bit. And I mentioned before that you have an early stage fund where you help founders with go-to-market planning as well. And you recently wrote posts on how founders are replacing friends and family rounds with operator angel rounds that can bring more value to the table beyond capital. Can you just elaborate on this and talk a bit about the value that operator angels can bring as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a really, I tend to be a very tech optimist person. And so I'll caveat it with that. But I do think that right now we're starting to see a shift in the ecosystem where historically a founder's first round would come from friends, family, kind of like individuals in your network. And so it was sort of this like door-to-door salesman sort of thing where you just like knock on the door of like everyone and ask them for a little bit of money. I think that, that created a serious disadvantage, for folks like myself. I grew up in Ohio. I'm not really in a unique position to start asking other people for money. And I didn't grow up in Silicon Valley or have any friends who are VCs. And so I think now what's interesting is there's a whole new class of founders and fundraising tactics. And I think if anything, being at a company like Atlassian, at Canva, at any of these high growth startups, you both build a really strong network And that strong network is great if you choose to start a company because you can work with your old colleagues again. I also think that there's a really unique advantage where, some of the best companies that I've seen in the last 12 months, some of the best companies to go on and raise like really impressive rounds, have all very strategically aligned with operator angels who have very specific expertise or specific sector experience. And so I think if anything, I do spend a lot of time with various different alumni networks where, I co-invest with the Airbnb syndicate a lot. I spend time with Lyft. There's these syndicate models where I think that if you either want to sell your software into a company like Airbnb, or you potentially want to hire folks who are Airbnb, like I think there are a lot of these new ecosystems that are emerging where it's great to strategically align your first round around, sector expertise and maybe access to different companies in a way where it's not really a friends and family round anymore. It's like every person on the cap table has a specific job and every person is incredibly helpful and it's clear in the value that they add.
And how can founders that may not have a strong existing network go about finding these operator angels? And what are some of the questions you think they can ask to discover whether there is strategic alignment there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think like right now the ecosystem is quite open. And I think if anything, like I'm very excited to see the amount of capital that will start flowing to new regions. I think that now that people are working from home, you have angel investors who are going out and raising their own funds. Like, I just think if anything, there's a lot of opportunity to, if you don't have access to a warm intro, like cold email, Twitter DMs, like there's just a lot of people who are very open and willing to engage with founders, especially if it's kind of aligned to their personal interests. And so if anything, you do find like there's a collective of SaaS angels that are all quite helpful and they just like building almost like their own portfolio of angel investments where all companies are quite similar. And I would say WorkLife was born out of that vision where I had invested in a lot of companies that looked quite similar. And, the founder to founder intros is how I've made most of my investments. And so I think it's like building your founder network, finding ways for warm intros. And I think the third thing is just being very proactive and thoughtful. Like I would say that, for most VCs, we do spend time following other founders on Twitter. We do spend time reading other people's newsletters. I think it's like, to what extent can you become like the known person in the sector in which you're building? And to what extent can you continue to build, both your local network, which I think is really important, but also starting to connect with investors that maybe have backed companies that you've either appreciated or enjoyed using, or, you find that there's some strategic alignment with both VCs and some of the angels as well.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for today, unfortunately, but thank you so much, Brianne, for being here.
Yeah, thanks again.
That's all good. And you are now off to the StartMate room for a private Q&A. And for everyone else, I'll see you at Catherine's session that's starting at 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Time for a great presentation on ways to rethink marketing during these what the F times. So thank you for joining us this morning, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah, see you soon.